My name is Fraser Doherty, I'm 24, I come from Edinburgh, and I'm the founder of a jam company called SuperJam, which I started when I was 14 using my grandmother's secret jam recipes, and over the past 10 years I've got my products into about 2,000 supermarkets and sold millions of jars along the way. I guess that my story shows that anybody can start a business, and that if you just have passion for what you do, you can make a success out of anything, even a really everyday, ordinary thing like jam. Definitely when I was starting out, one of the best places I went for advice was events like this summit, and I think just getting to meet other people who are thinking about starting a business and people who have done it, it's just a great way of getting advice and figuring out what the next steps might be. I guess my advice to anybody trying to start a business would be to not be afraid. I think so many people have an idea for a business, but they're just afraid of taking the first steps, and I think that's a real shame. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Fraser Doherty. I'm 24 years old. I come from Davison's Mains in Edinburgh, and I'm the founder of a jam company called SuperJam. And I was very kindly invited along today by Bruce to share my story with you. And that's the story of how I learned my grandmother's secret jam recipe at the age of 14. And over the past 9 or 10 years, I've turned her recipes into a company that has since sold millions of jars of jam through thousands of supermarkets around the world. I guess you could say that my adventures as an entrepreneur began at an unusually young age. And in fact, ever since I was a little boy, I was involved in coming up with ideas to try and start my own business. And probably the most harebrained story of all comes from when I was about 10. And I visited a chicken farm with my childhood friend. And we asked the farmer to give us a box of eggs, which we took home to my mom and dad, and explained that we had this great business idea that we would keep the eggs warm so they would hatch, and we would start our own chicken farm in the back garden. And as I'm sure you can imagine, my parents weren't exactly very excited about this business idea of turning the garden into a chicken farm, but they let us give it a shot, not really imagining that 2 10-year-old kids could find a way of hatching eggs. And so we put the box of eggs on top of the Sky TV box under the telly. It was kind of warm. And amazingly, a few weeks later, 4 of the eggs hatched into little chickens. And I mean, the poor things probably thought that Jeremy Kyle was their mum, you know, but we raised them in the house and we gave them names, and soon put them out into the garden and they started laying eggs, which we sold to the neighbors. And so that was my first ever business at the age of 10. Unfortunately though, my career as a chicken farmer was sadly cut short one afternoon when the local fox decided to eat my chickens for dinner. And as tragic and upsetting as that day was, it didn't put me off entirely. And I continued to come up with more and more ideas to try and start my own business. And so one afternoon when I was 14 years old, I was visiting my grandmother. She was making jam in her kitchen, just in the same way as she had for as long as I can remember. And that's a picture of my gran there. She's the one in the middle. And I got really excited about it, and I asked my gran to teach me how to make jam. And we spent the afternoon making a few jars together. And same day, I ran around to the supermarket, I bought some fruit, and made a few jars of my own. And before they even cooled down, I took them around the neighbors and asked all the neighbors what they thought. And thankfully, the neighbors at least told me that they enjoyed the first few jars of jam that I had ever made, and asked if they could start buying it from me. And so I was soon cooking jam in my parents' kitchen, delivering out of a little plastic bucket, door to door, all over the local area. After a while, the local newspaper heard about this story of a young guy taking his grand's jam recipes and making a little business, and that's an article from page 3 of the Edinburgh Evening News from when I was about 15, which I guess probably just meant there wasn't really anything happening in Edinburgh that day, something like that to make it into the news. But following the excitement of being written about in the paper, I soon started working full-time on trying to turn my jam-making hobby into my career. And so I soon found myself cooking jam all day, every day, in my parents' little kitchen, cooking up to 1,000 jars of jam a week and selling them at farmers' markets all over Scotland. Soon it got to the point my parents couldn't get into the kitchen to cook the dinner anymore, and I realized I was going to have to come up with some kind of big idea to move production into a factory. And so I started doing a lot of research, and I found out that sales of jam have been in decline for the past couple of decades, mostly because jam's very unhealthy. It's usually about 70% sugar and contains a lot of additives. I guess when I looked at the other brands of jam on the supermarket shelves, I figured they were very traditional, nothing had changed for a long time, and I just figured that maybe I could come up with a healthier and more modern and more fun brand of jam. And so hundreds of batches and lots of recipes later, in my parents' little kitchen, I came up with a way of making jam 100% from fruit, without adding any sugar or anything artificial. I soon had a few flavors that I thought tasted pretty nice, and probably quite naively decided I was going to try and sell them to the big supermarkets. And that was something that a teenager had never done before, but I got my big break, I guess, when I got a chance to pitch my idea to Waitrose at a Meet the Buyer Day. And Meet the Buyer Days, I like to describe as the X factor of selling groceries to supermarkets. And hundreds of people show up and stand in a queue holding their homemade cakes and soups and sauces, and everybody gets 10 minutes to pitch their idea. In my case, to the senior jam buyer of Waitrose. And he said it was a great idea to make jam 100% from fruit. He said it was a lot of fun to see this kid turning up with his dad's suit on, probably 2 sizes too big for me. But he explained there was a long way to go until I would ever have anything I could sell to a supermarket. I'd have to set up production in a factory and offer him a good price. I'd have to get labels designed that would explain to people why they should buy my products, and I'd have to do a lot more work on my recipes before he'd be happy. But he promised that if I could do all of that, I'd be welcome to go back, maybe in a year's time, and he'd think about giving it a shot. So having met with Waitrose, it became my dream to one day see my products on their shelves. And I began by trying to create the SuperJam brand, the design of the labels and the website. And working with some local designers, we figured that there was a link between SuperJam and Superman, or so we thought, and decided to create the brand around a comic book theme. We had a lot of fun writing jokes on the labels and on the lids, and we even spoke about making a superhero costume for me, the Jam Boy, to wear at the launch of the whole thing, which I was quite looking forward to. So we then had this set of labels that I thought looked pretty cool, and definitely my teenage friends thought were very funny, and began trying to solve the problem of how to produce hundreds of thousands of jars of jam to sell to the big supermarkets. And obviously, at 17 years old, I wasn't really in a position to build a jam factory. I was going to have to convince an existing manufacturer to work with me to make my recipes on a big scale. And so I traveled all around the country, from the little islands in Scotland to the big cities in England, trying to find somebody with a jam factory who'd be willing to work with me. And as I'm sure you can imagine, most of these 100-year-old, very traditional family businesses were a bit skeptical of a 17-year-old turning up with no money and no experience, no idea how factories worked, no idea how supermarkets worked. But eventually I found one factory who had suffered from jam sales falling. They had some spare capacity. They figured my idea was worth a shot. And so a few months later, we'd figured out how to make my recipes on a big scale, and I figured I was ready to start supplying Waitrose. Waitrose didn't agree. They explained to me the fact that SuperJam was made completely from fruit was all lost in all the jokes and humor on the comic book labels. They said the factory I chose was way too expensive, and they didn't even like the flavors I'd made. So basically everything that I just spent a year working on had to be thrown in the bin, and I started all over again. So I traveled around a bit more and eventually convinced a new factory to work with me. The designers and I sat down and had a really good think about what the packaging should look like. And I started to ask for advice from other brands that I thought had great packaging. And I got in touch with a company called Method, which was run by a Scottish guy at the time. And the first time I'd had any interest in cleaning products, but they had built a hugely successful business on the back of having really simple, nice packaging. Another brand was Dorset Cereals, and their packaging is really simple. They just kind of use a couple of colors. They only really say what needs to be said. And actually, by being so simple, they're able to stand out compared to the really noisy, colorful brands like Kellogg's Corn Flakes beside them on the shelf. But a brand that I was most inspired by would be Innocent. And I met with those guys. They gave me some advice. They told me everything they learned about packaging design. And one thing they said was that too many people try and say, here are 10 reasons why you should buy my product. And they list them all on the front of the package. But they figured if you could just come up with one good reason why anybody should buy your product and put all of your energy and all of your design into just trying to get that one message across, then maybe when somebody spends half a second in the supermarket looking at your product, they'll get your message, and maybe if they get it, then they'll buy your product. And so having taken on board that advice, I realized all we had to do was get this message of 100% fruit across. And so we went through a few different designs that didn't work at all, until eventually came up with one that hopefully does. And the packaging is really simple, very modern, very different to the comic book idea, very different to the traditional jam packaging I showed you at the start. And thankfully, after all of that, Waitrose agreed. And they launched SuperJam in all of their 300 stores about 6 years ago now. And that obviously meant we had to do the first production run in the factory, which was a really exciting and quite an emotional day. I think we made something like 50,000 jars on the first day. And when SuperJam launched in Waitrose, there was a huge amount of media coverage. I found myself being written about in newspapers and magazines, and I had no idea that would happen. We didn't really do anything to try and make it happen. But I guess to try and take advantage of all of that media coverage, I decided to go on a rock and roll style tour around all the supermarkets, handing out samples and signing jars of jam and telling people all about my gran and my story. And I think on the first day in one store here in Edinburgh in Morningside, they sold more than 1,500 jars of SuperJam in one day. It was more jam than they would normally sell in a whole month. They'd never seen anything like it. And I think it got to the point where if anybody tried to go through the checkout without any SuperJam, the person working on the checkout would check they hadn't forgotten. And so then we had a big party when we sold the millionth jar. We launched it in Tesco and Asda and Sainsbury's, Morrison's, and a couple of thousand supermarkets. I got invited to have dinner with the Prime Minister at Downing Street when he heard about it, which was kind of cool. The products got put into the National Museum of Scotland as an example of an iconic Scottish brand, alongside Iron Brew and Baxter's and Tonic's tea cakes. My story was used to advertise mobile phones and business cards on a TV advert for moo.com. But probably my proudest moment of all, the biggest promotion we ever did was we gave away a free jar of SuperJam to every reader of the Sun newspaper. I think about 5.5 million people read the Sun every day. And so my proudest moment of all as a Scottish person was being able to share the front page of the Sun with our national hero, Susan Boyle. Another particular highlight of mine was making my debut on QVC, the home TV shopping channel. And I go on there and tell the story, and people phone up and buy jam from their TV. And that's been a huge success. We're getting ready to have an hour-long SuperJam show in the run-up to Christmas, which you must be sure to tune into. SuperJam has launched in countries as far away as Australia, in countries as strange as Russia. And when we recently launched in Japan, my life story was made into a dramatized TV reenactment in which I was played by a small Indian boy. I guess we became the first jam company in the world to launch an iPhone app with recipes and videos and some other bits and pieces. We're about to launch a range of jams for children with kind of cute packaging and without any seeds, because kids don't like seeds. We're launching some marmalades and all kinds of gifts for Mother's Day and Father's Day and Pancake Day and Christmas and everything I can think of, really. Something I'm really excited about has been setting up a honey business, which I'm sure you can guess is called Super Honey, which was inspired by an experience that I had as a kid where one of our neighbors had some beehives in his garden, and he taught me how to keep bees. As a kid, I thought they were fascinating, and we've started installing beehives around the UK to kind of give kids a chance to learn beekeeping, generally to promote beekeeping and try and challenge some of the problems that bees are facing. And then obviously we sell the honey that the bees make. For me, this idea of trying to run a business in a way that hopefully does some good was inspired when I read about an American ice cream company called Ben & Jerry's when I was a teenager. And a few months ago, I got to meet my hero, Jerry, and he ended up sending me to Uganda in Africa, where I got to stay with a family in a really simple home. They were very poor. They had no electricity, no water. The most expensive thing they owned was this very sad-looking cow tied up in the back garden. But as well as being a humbling experience, I got to meet some beekeepers out there. And they had made some really simple beehives just out of leaves and wood. And it got me thinking that it would be cool to set up a project giving a chance for families, like the one that I stayed with, to make a bit of money selling fair trade honey to the UK. So we started working on that, which is kind of cool. We're about to launch SuperJam in America, which has meant we've had to translate everything from English into American. Sounds a bit silly, but Packaging and website and everything has to be a little bit different. And of course, the jam probably has to be in a bigger jar. Sorry. So SuperJam has gratefully received a number of awards along the way. I'm not telling you about them to boast by any means, but the one that I'm most proud of was called the Global Student Entrepreneur of the Year Award. And that was a competition in America where most of the other kids in the competition were running .com businesses, software companies, iPhone apps, and I was there selling jam and amazingly won the awards. And I got to meet a lot of other kids who started their own businesses, and that was really inspiring for me. So I guess from the point of view of sales and media coverage and even winning a few awards, it's all been quite an adventure and I guess something of a success, and that's all fine and well. But something I'm really excited about and ambitious for has been setting up a charity. And to give you a bit of background, when my gran originally made jam, she would make jam and scones, and she'd visit all the elderly people in the care homes in the East End of Glasgow, and she would drag my little brother and I with her at the weekends, and he plays guitar and I'd tell him stories, and we had no idea why as kids, but it was just something that my gran felt strongly about. And so a couple of years ago, we started running free tea parties in community centres and care homes and hospitals, originally in Scotland, but we now do them all over the UK. We have them in Australia and all over the place. We have more than 100 parties every year. The biggest ones have as many as 600 people at them, so thousands of elderly people have come along and hopefully had a nice time. As part of the Tea Parties project, we have a Tea Cozy of the Week competition, where the elderly people knit tea cozies, and we feature a different one on the blog every week. This one is a mouse. We've even had a Jesus tea cozy sent in from America. It's kind of fun. I've got a little video of a tea party that I'll show you just to bring it to life.
You don't need a Mad Hatter or a Cheshire Cat to have a wonderful tea party, just plenty of jam and scones. Today's tea party at Edinburgh's Meadowbank Stadium was set up by Fraser Doherty, the young entrepreneur who transformed his grand secret jam recipe into a multi-million-pound SuperJam business.
My grandmother taught me how to make jam when I was 14, and that's what started SuperJam off. When my gran originally made jam, she would make jam and scones and cakes and take them to all the elderly people in her area who were living alone, and they were a little bit lonely and nobody really visited them very much, and she would take my little brother and I with her at the weekends. And so I guess visiting and caring for the elderly was something that my gran felt very strongly about, and the tea party is an opportunity for me to give back to my gran's generation.
So what are you hoping that the tea parties will achieve?
Well, the idea is very simple. A lot of the people who come along here live in care homes or sheltered housing, or they live alone, and the opportunity to make new friends and have a bit of fun on an afternoon is quite rare for them. And so this is an opportunity for them to just have a bit of fun, some jam, and get up and have a dance if they like.
It brings back very happy memories of when I was a youngster, teenager, dancing in the city here in Princess Street Gardens and Marine down at Portobello. I just love this. It's just wonderful and can't get enough.
And why do you think it's a good idea to let all the older people come here this afternoon?
Lots of old people are on their own and they need some entertainment, and this is what is good for us. You know, it keeps us active, it keeps us moving, it keeps us meeting people.
That's the best idea. Thousands of elderly people have come along and had a fun afternoon and made new friends, and I've got a wall covered in letters from the guests who've come along and just told me how special it is. One gentleman told him that it made him feel like a person again.
Fraser, I was hoping to get a scone myself, but I don't see any. They've all gone. Where's your secret stash?
We always bring more scones to each tea party, and every time we run out, I think everybody just enjoys the scones and jam, and sometimes they can eat up to 4 scones each.
Fraser had his first tea party last June. There have since been over 100 events, and the plan is to roll them out on a regular basis across the country. The aim being not only to give the older generation a chance to go out and have some fun, but also to interact with the younger generation. How am I doing, Walter?
Yes, fine.
Should we try another turn?
Yes.
Okay.
Probably the best part of running the tea parties is interacting with the elderly people and just hearing their stories. Some of the guests are over 100 years old, and they've lived through wars, they've lived through the invention of television, of all sorts of things, and their stories are just incredible and often inspirational.
And has your gran been along to one of the tea dances? What does she think?
My gran's very excited about the tea parties. It's an issue that she feels very strongly about, and to be able to give back to her generation is really special to me.
Thank you. So I guess to try and raise some money for the tea parties, a year or so ago, my gran and I decided to share our jam making secrets with the world by publishing a cookbook all about how to make jam without adding sugar and how to make puddings that have jam in them. And when we launched the book, we threw a big party to thank all of the people who had helped to make SuperJam a success. I've also written another book which is called Super Business, which is all about my story and all the stuff I've learned and all of the advice that people have given me along the way. The books have sold something like 70,000 copies, which has raised a lot of money for the tea parties. It means we can have hundreds more in the future. The books have also gone on to be published in places as far away from home as Korea and Japan. I've no idea what they say, mind you, but places that my gran and I would never have imagined an afternoon spent making jam 10 years ago would take us. And I should mention that I've brought plenty of copies of the books to sell afterwards. If anybody would like to support the tea parties, we'll be doing that outside. But I guess that's kind of my story. And perhaps what my story shows is that something that can begin for anybody as a hobby or a passion in a kitchen or a bedroom or a garage with a bit of love and imagination and some hard work can grow into something amazing, can grow into something that changes your life. I know that SuperJam certainly changed mine. Can grow into something that gives you a career and hopefully a chance to give something back to your community. I guess there's a number of people that I need to thank for making my story possible, not least, of course, my grandmother for teaching me how to make jam in the first place and inspiring the work that I do with the elderly. She's thankfully unaware of her intellectual property rights. Hasn't come chasing me for royalties. But she does get a lot of free jam. And she's really proud of everything that's happened, of course. She goes in Tasda and makes sure all the labels are facing the front and turns the competitors around the wrong way. My parents were letting me cook jam in the kitchen for years on end, but the best help and support I had was from having a mentor, a local guy called Kevin Doran, who gave me a lot of advice about getting into supermarkets. And so I guess I would say to everybody, try and find someone who's been there and done it before to be your mentor. And I guess the last people I need to thank on my amazing adventure are all of you guys for very kindly having me here, Bruce for inviting me, hopefully get to speak to some of you later on, but until then, thank you.